Thank you for joining us, and good evening, and welcome to tonight's program, What is it going to take? Redistricting 2021. My name is Chris Barbie, and I serve as Director of Development here at Levine Museum of the New South. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the support of the Infusion Fund, a partnership between the City of Charlotte, Foundation for the Carolinas, and donors who support the arts and culture sector, as well as the support of North Carolina Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. We would also like to thank Bank of America and Corning Optical Communications for their sponsorship tonight. If you wish to learn more and financially support the museum in its effort to offer engaging programming, content, and experiences, please follow the link in the comments. Likewise, we would love your feedback about tonight's program, including suggestions for future topics. Please click on the survey link in the comments section for a very short survey. We would really appreciate it. Feedback always helps us make our programs better. And now to the program. Here in North Carolina, we have been in the middle of redistricting controversies for decades, and we are glad to be joined tonight by Dr. Michael Bitzer and Harry Taylor to talk about this complicated matter. At the core of tonight's discussion is also Dr. Bitzer's new book, Redistricting and Gerrymandering in North Carolina, Battlelines in the Tar Heel State. The book provides new insights into the state's struggles with redistricting. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bitzer, who joins us again for a timely conversation. Dr. Bitzer is a professor of politics and history at Catawba College, where he teaches a number of courses in the fields of American politics, public administration and policy, and law. Along with his teaching responsibilities, he serves as a political analyst for several media sources, and you may have read his takes on many of the recent news articles on redistricting. Dr. Bitzer also blogs about North Carolina politics at oldnorthstatepolitics.com. And I'll pass it on to our moderator for tonight, Harry Taylor, a commercial real estate broker and longtime environmental and community activist. Frustrated with running for political office in a severely gerrymandered district, he began speaking publicly about redistricting reform early in 2009. In 2017, Harry launched the Muppet-inspired initiative Flush Gerrymander. He is a musician and is active with Common Cause, Democracy North Carolina, and the League of Women Voters. Thank you both for joining us and for giving us a better sense of the dynamics facing the nation as it confronts the 2020 census and the subsequent redistricting efforts. Thanks again, gentlemen, for leading this discussion. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Chris.
You want to go ahead and push off, Michael, on your screen share?
Sure. What I thought we would do is, Harry and I have talked a little bit, and what I thought I would do is start off tonight's discussion about redistricting in North Carolina with just a very short overview of some of the basic principles, talk a little bit about the history of redistricting, and then Harry's got some questions, and we will certainly entertain questions from the audience. So I want to thank Chris first and foremost for the very kind introduction, and certainly to Harry for being willing to help moderate this discussion tonight. I think it's an important one. In the General Assembly over the past week and a half, 2 weeks, we've seen some maps that have been drawn. And my expectation is that likely we will see some finalized version of the congressional and state legislative maps come out sometime this week, probably by the end of the week, potentially early next week, because what we understand is their deadline, they want to try and have this accomplished by the end of this month. So with that kind of just preface, let me go ahead and share just a short presentation.
While you're doing that, Michael, I want to remind everybody that if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube and you want to ask questions, you need to log into that program. Otherwise, you won't be able to ask questions.
Right. So let's see. You would think after a year and a half, a professor would have, all right. So hopefully folks are able to see Redistricting 2021 in overview. And this is the current congressional map that we are under. This will certainly change. So if you're trying to find yourself in a particular congressional district, don't worry, it will change fairly soon because we are adding not just redistricting to it, but we're adding an additional congressional seat to the process as well. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. Just a real brief overview for what I'm presenting in terms of pulling some information out of the book that I just recently published. What I want to do is just briefly go through about the past 40 years worth of redistricting history. And it's going to be very brief, very short. Each decade, I argue, has had an important case out of North Carolina that has dealt with the issue of redistricting. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the major cases coming out of North Carolina during the past 40 years, and then talk about this year's redistricting principles. The General Assembly set some criteria for how they are going about drawing the maps. We can talk a little bit, and I'll give a little bit of explanation as to some of those principles. And then also, I think it's important kind of thinking about this presentation as an overview of the concept of redistricting, and we can get into gerrymandering as well. But some basic terms and principles, I think, is helpful for folks to be grounded so that we can have the kind of conversation that's needed about this important subject. Now, North Carolina's redistricting really is kind of a past maybe 70 years worth of really intensive dynamics in this state. And I point to in the book really the start of the 1960s decade and the U.S. Supreme Court's redistricting revolution. In that decade, a number of cases came out of the U.S. Supreme Court. The most important one was a case, Reynolds v. Sims, and the principal idea of one person, one vote. That legislative districts, particularly congressional districts, needed to be equal in population. We'll get to a discussion about the principle of state legislative districts that can have a little bit of wiggle room, but really the dynamic of these Supreme Court cases out of the 1960s heralded a whole new environment for redistricting that we are still dealing with today. For North Carolina, the 1980s began a really intensive debate over two critical aspects: redistricting and the role of race in redistricting. This was a time period particularly where Black Democrats were starting to assert their political influence and their political power. And a case out of North Carolina that dealt with the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Section 2 in particular, the Thornburg v. Gingles case, really kind of heralded a key Supreme Court principle about redistricting and how much one can take race into account. By the 1990s, that debate over race and redistricting is continuing into that next decade. And for those folks who were around in the state in the 1990s, the Shaw v. Reno case, particularly for folks in Mecklenburg County, had a profound impact on how North Carolina would draw congressional districts and the issue of racial gerrymandering. Now, to give you a sense of what that debate was all about, this next slide presents a map of what was eventually drawn as the 12th congressional district in North Carolina. And you will notice that it basically skews across the Piedmont, the central region of the state. The district was designed to elect a Black representative to the U.S. House of Representatives. And this was at the behest, really the influence of the then George H.W. Bush Department of Justice. They were pushing what was called at the time the maximization policy, where if a state could maximize the number of Black districts that would elect Black representation, they should do so. Before this district was drawn, North Carolina Democrats, who controlled the General Assembly, drew a district, a majority-minority district in the eastern part of the state. The Department of Justice, using the Voting Rights Act and Section 5, denied the first round of maps, saying you can draw 2 congressional districts that would elect a Black representative. And the original district, the impetus for this particular 12th congressional district, came from a Republican who drew a district that basically stretched from Charlotte up to the Virginia state line. This became the model for what we see in front of us now, this map that or this district that basically started west of Gastonia, came into Charlotte, picked up Black precincts there, went up I-77 into Statesville, cut across towards Salisbury, and basically rode along I-85, dipping into Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and eventually ending up in Durham. One of the standing jokes about this congressional district was that if you stopped in one lane of I-85 and opened both car doors, you could be in 3 different congressional districts at the same time. And so this really spurred a lot of litigation regarding whether this was focused too much on racial dynamics and racial politics. And the case Shaw v. Reno kind of set the groundwork, particularly from an opinion by then Sandra Day O'Connor, an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, who basically looked at this map and said, you know, I may not be able to know racial gerrymandering, but I think I can see it in this kind of a map. And so the case of Shaw v. Reno set an entire kind of legacy and prodigy for other cases dealing with race and redistricting, particularly out of states like Georgia and Texas. But really, Shaw v. Reno was the key case that started a lot of this discussion. Into the 2000s, we seem to have the concept of firming up when race can be utilized in redistricting in the Strickland case. But then we hit the 2010s. And in fact, in the book, each chapter kind of covers the 3 key decades, the 1980s, the 90s, and the 2000s. I had to actually split up the chapter on the 2010s because dealing with race and then partisan redistricting was just so overwhelming in terms of the number of cases. Again, in 2010, we open up a discussion, the Harris case, about race and redistricting at the congressional level, as well as at the state legislative level. And then in the back half of the 2010 decade, we open up a national conversation about the role of partisanship and gerrymandering in redistricting with the Rucho and then the state case of Lewis. Now, the Rucho case is fairly important because along with Maryland, North Carolina seems to have closed the door on the federal courts inserting themselves or being part of the issue regarding partisan gerrymandering. This was a controversial case handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court with Chief Justice Roberts writing the majority opinion in a very divided court. But what we see come out of that is the power of states to then begin to have their input and their impact on the dynamics of redistricting. And that was the Lewis case here in North Carolina that basically said partisan gerrymandering can go too excessive. And so we have a kind of 40-year legacy of the legislature having the primary power over redistricting. But as I described, the courts are always interested parties. Now, to kind of talk about the General Assembly and their role in this year's redistricting, they have established a set of criteria first and foremost dealing with population. For the congressional districts, they have to be nearly as equal as practical, what we call zero deviation for population purposes. For the state legislative districts, there's a plus or minus 5% wiggle room to allow the districts to be not equal, but close enough to each other. Another criteria established is the idea of contiguity. This is the idea that the districts should always connect. And North Carolina has had an interesting history with a particular aspect of this particular factor, and that is point contiguity. They said this year, no point contiguity, but in the past, that has been used. And to give a brief example, back in the 1991 Congressional District proposal, there were districts that basically came to a very discrete point. Rockingham and Forsyth County, along with Stokes and Guilford, all came to a very discrete kind of point that the counties met up at. But as you'll notice, Rockingham and Forsyth were placed in the 5th Congressional District. Stokes and Guilford were put into the 6th. So that idea of point contiguity has been utilized in the past, is not being utilized in this round of redistricting. Now, one of the key things dealing with the state legislative districts is the notion of county groupings. And this comes out of an important case called the Stevenson case that basically said to the legislature, the North Carolina Supreme Court said to the legislature, you have to draw state legislative districts in counties as long as you can keep them whole. That is a constitutional provision in the state constitution that legislative districts have to be drawn in as many whole counties as possible. And what we have now is the dynamic of county groupings that are associated together that can then have districts drawn within them. Another key principle that they are trying to respect this year are voting tabulation districts, what we commonly refer to as precincts, trying to keep them whole so that county election administrators don't have to deal with different ballots for people that live in the same precinct. Municipal boundaries and communities of interest will be considered. And this may be a controversial area because of other factors that I'll get into in just a moment. But this idea of communities of interest has always been a stated goal of redistricting, going back to the early districts in the 1790s. But this principle has never been fully articulated or defined oftentimes. It could be based on economics. It could be based on politics. It could be based on social connections. But this principle of communities of interest does get attention every now and then in redistricting. Compactness. We want districts that look fairly compact, that aren't necessarily spread across major geographic areas. That's getting harder and harder to do, particularly with the shift of demographics to urban areas as opposed to rural counties in this state. They will take into account the residency of where members currently live. And this is oftentimes utilized as the term incumbent protection. That's a natural part of the political activity of redistricting. Two important statements that were made was about data that shall not be used in constructing the congressional or state legislative plans. One is over racial data, with the exception of having districts that comply with the Voting Rights Act. And I think that this will be, if I had to predict, this will probably be one area that we will see some litigation over when these maps are approved, particularly from the Department of Justice. The Biden Department of Justice back in September sent out a statement that they were going to use the Voting Rights Act to look at redistricting processes to make sure that race was not being impacted too much by redistricting principles. And then finally, election results and partisan considerations, the political dynamics. Add on top of that all of these factors that are going to be taken into account, we think, based on drawing the maps. At the congressional level, add in a 14th congressional seat. This is a new day in North Carolina politics. We've never had 14 congressional seats. Our electoral votes also go up as well. But as one author that I studied under at the University of Georgia, who wrote a book on redistricting, has described it, redistricting is the most political activity in American politics. And adding a congressional district only ramps up that political dynamic even further. Some other basic redistricting terms and principles to be aware of that you'll probably start to hear in the very near future: multi-member and single-member districts. What we have now primarily are single-member districts. We elect one representative out of a district. Whoever wins that district gets 100% of that particular seat. That, in combination with what we have as what's called first past the post elections, meaning the winner is determined by whoever gets one more vote than the person who comes in second. So what generally tends to happen is with single member districts and with winners potentially getting the victory, the 100% of the district, without having to get to 50% of the vote, that tends to automatically skew elections to the favor of the party that wins. If you win, you get 100%. If you come within one vote but come in second, you don't get anything. And so these kinds of basic dynamics of our elections have an influence on the outcomes along with the lines for redistricting. You will hear a lot about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and in particular, two sections, Section 2 and Section 5. Now, the Section 5, as I note here, is no longer in effect because of a U.S. Supreme Court case called Shelby County. This was the provision in the 1965 Voting Rights Act that covered a number of counties in North Carolina and also required the state to go to Washington and to the Attorney General if any election-related laws were changed, and redistricting was one of them. We had to garner what was called pre-clearance under Section 5. Well, that section is no longer held as constitutional, but Section 2 is still being utilized and will likely be utilized by the Biden administration in reviewing redistricting plans. We have in North Carolina the long history of majority-minority districts, meaning districts that will elect a minority representative to Congress or to the state house or state senate. Retrogression is the principle that if you have a majority-minority district or minority populations, you cannot adversely impact them in the next round of redistricting. And I know I'm going extremely fast, but I want to kind of get through all of these terms and principles and get to the questions. There's also the principle of what is called legitimate state interest. And this is oftentimes up to state governments to make the case in courts, either federal court or state court, that what they did, the policies, the procedures, the redistricting principles, they had a legitimate state interest in seeking to do so. We will probably hear this term bantered about in the future litigation. The 14th Amendment. In that particular amendment to the U.S. Constitution, it says that no state shall deny any person the equal protection of the laws. We oftentimes refer to this as the Equal Protection Clause. And that is, again, something that has been at the heart, oftentimes, of questions about race and redistricting. In North Carolina, the state constitution, Article 1, Section 10, is very simple, 5 words. All elections shall be free. But this, out of 2019's cases, has become kind of the center point for the fight, particularly over partisan gerrymandering and the partisan dynamics of redistricting. The term that we've been using constantly, gerrymandering, has been with us since the dawn of the Republic. And in fact, the first time that we see an attempt by one political party to impact another political party's fortunes, or more likely their disfavor in elections, was actually out of Virginia, when Patrick Henry tried to gerrymander James Madison out of a congressional district. We associate the term, however, with a Massachusetts governor, Elbridge Gerry. His name was actually pronounced with a hard G, but gerrymandering picked up the term when he signed off on a state Senate map that basically looked like a salamander had scrawled across a map, creating a district. We now have gerrymandering. And that is oftentimes associated with both race and with partisanship. One final aspect that I want to have a conversation with and make sure that folks are aware of is the principle of following the map's approval, the courts will become interested parties. And we will actually have a dual judicial system. The North Carolina state courts, when and if these maps are contested in state court, it will likely be before a 3-judge state trial panel. And that decision coming out of that trial court could be appealed to the North Carolina State Supreme Court to set state law. But we also have the federal courts as an interested party in this dynamic. And that will start off in federal district court, potentially go up to the federal appeals court, and then ultimately to the Supreme Court of the United States. And one important note, any decision that comes out of a state Supreme Court that has what is called a federal question, an issue that potentially federal law could impact, that decision could also go to the U.S. Supreme Court as well. And so for the past 40 years, North Carolina courts, both federal and state, have been integral to the redistricting process that we have seen play out. So with that, I'll open it up to questions from Harry, and we'll see how the evening goes in terms of the remainder of questions to be shared throughout the evening.
Sorted, is it not, Michael?
Sir?
Yeah. And so one of the things I wanted to, that I hear often is from people, they say, well, the Democrats did it to us for 100 years, and now we're doing it back to them. That's their excuse for doing what they do. But in fact, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party shape-shifted after during Reagan's time. So the Democratic Party in name may have gerrymandered the state for 100 years, but it was the conservatives and liberals were different in different parties. Speak to that for just a second.
Wow, that is a great question, and I've actually tried to deal with that question in a class that I'm teaching. Normally, that's about a 3-week lecture period in my Southern politics and political parties class, and it's hard actually for current day students, current day college students, to understand that at one point, the Democratic Party was the more racially conservative party because of the impact of the South, and that the Republican Party was the more liberal on race party, the advocate for civil rights. I hearken back and help them try and understand the timeline of some key elections in the 20th century, 1948 in particularly. This was kind of the start of the collapse of the New Deal coalition. The Democratic Party was the majority party in the country. But the South, that was a very solid Democratic South, started to rebel against Northern Democrats who were pushing civil rights for African Americans in their communities. And so what we had in the 1948 presidential contest was Harry Truman representing the civil rights Democrats and Strom Thurmond, the then governor of South Carolina, representing the Dixiecrat Party. That split started the parties kind of shifting themselves around the issue of race. And by the 1960s, 20 years after that, we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act. We have the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And in the span of the 20th century, those two pieces of legislation were probably the most monumental ones passed in that 100-year period. And what we saw with the passage of that was certainly both Democrats and Republicans supporting both of those pieces of legislation. But we started to see within the Republican Party the rise of the modern day conservative movement led by folks like Barry Goldwater that started to shift the dynamic away from Republicans being advocates for civil rights towards states' rights, towards the principles that Democrats had typically tended to support. In the South, in particularly, white Southerners who were conservatives then started to break away from the Democratic Party and realign themselves to the party of Goldwater, to Nixon and his Southern strategy, and then eventually to Reagan and his modern day conservatism that we see today. So it's really a very long time period of gradual changes by both the parties and by the voters, particularly here in the South.
Yeah. And we have, which I know this from personal experience, an awful lot of people down here in the South, especially in the rural areas, who remain registered as Democrats, but they only vote, but they vote Republican all the time, or they may vote in Democratic primary, but they're not true Democrats. So that's
in this state in particular, that we used to talk about this thing called Jesse-crats.
Yeah.
And that, Democrats had a very long history, particularly registered Democrats, because daddy was a Democrat and granddaddy was a Democrat and great-granddaddy was a Democrat. So I'm a Democrat. That was just the legacy of the Solid South and the Democratic hold that the Solid South had. But by the 1960s into the 1980s, those conservative white voters were transitioning to the Republican Party. And the historic legacy, particularly of the boomer generation in the South, was very much, daddy would not appreciate, or he would roll over in his grave if I switched to being a registered Republican. But in the privacy of the voting booth, I'm going to vote Republican. And so this kind of dynamic of generational shifting going on is certainly still a legacy in North Carolina politics. We've also had the legacy of split ticket voters, people that would vote Republican at the top of the ticket, vote Democratic for governor, then maybe Republican for U.S. House, Democrat for state house. I mean, they would kind of bounce around. By this point, 2008, 2010, the elections afterwards, that population of split ticket voters has shrunk considerably. And in some of the research that I have done on past legislative districts, the relationship between how a district voted at the presidential level and how it votes at the congressional or even state house level is now almost a perfect relationship. There's a perfect correlation between the two. And so a lot of this dynamic is also driven by voter behavior, as well as the lines that are used to draw these districts.
Right. I wanted to, in going through your book, it's complex and you really got to take good notes to keep track of where you are.
Yep.
But I keep coming across comments by people, and that will ring true to probably everybody on this broadcast tonight. This was Earl Warren back in and I guess it's the Reynolds Sims case back in God, when was that, in the 50s or whenever that was? But
1960.
Earl Warren, the right to vote freely for the candidate of one's choice is the essence of a democratic society, and any restrictions on that right strike at the heart of representative government. And gerrymandering does that. Also was noting that this was your writing. It's up in, North Carolina. North Carolina had no. Oh, here I wanted to go on that one, just not yet. Elena Kagan, you mentioned the Rucho case and how the court responded to that, and you write in your book, Elena Kagan in dissent on Common Cause versus Rucho. Kagan contended that Roberts paid little attention to the constitutional harms at the core of partisan gerrymandering before reviewing the procedures of both North Carolina and Maryland, which is also part of that, got folded in the case, which she labeled as grisly tales. Kagan bitterly asked, is this how American democracy is supposed to work? So it's, both parties have done this over time. And so this isn't your typical whodunit because everybody done it. But even at the highest level of the judicial system in our country, people think it's wrong and it doesn't fit. But it goes on and on and on and on. And I think in North Carolina, it's going to take a political party that has the power and the will to get rid of gerrymandering before it ever happens. So I know that's something we were on a call the other night and you were talking about that, but what is it going to take to get some other method of drawing districts other than allowing the politicians in power in Raleigh, the political party in Raleigh, to draw districts that favor them at the disfavor of most of the voters in the state?
And I think this isn't just a North Carolina issue. I think we are seeing this across the country. A number of states have gone to systems that basically take the power of redistricting, the redrawing of the district lines, out of the legislature's hands. Because, for lack of a better term, there is a real self-interest, particularly for the majority party that controls the legislature, to have the power to stay in power is what they're actually trying to do. And a number of states have gone to what they call independent redistricting commissions. I think it's still early, but we can look to our neighbors to the north, to Virginia, to see an attempt to try and take the redistricting process and try and get out of the partisan nature of it. Unfortunately, what I think is happening, however, is that politics is still embedded in the process. And I'm not sure, even if you have, a set of individuals, as Aristotle noted, we are all political creatures. We are by human nature political animals. And unfortunately, what tends to happen is that attempt to use politics and to use redistricting is oftentimes self-interested. We want to keep power. We believe our party is the right party to be in power. And with today's dynamics, in terms of how we see this play out, the voters have also basically sorted themselves into the political parties as well. I'm a believer that politics is part of this process, it can be detrimental and call into question. And in fact, Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion in the Rucho case, said, yeah, there was a lot of politics going on in this. The question from that case, how can the courts determine when politics is too much? And that's oftentimes a real tough question to get at. And I think we will see that question come up in this round of redistricting, because what we also see is the power of technology and the power of computer mapping to really kind of create districts that hold fairly reliably over time. But we also use technology to say this is perhaps out of the real potential of being a true representation for a map. It's just going to have to play itself out, I think, in the courts.
So presume, just for the heck of it, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have
Sure.
map, and probably the next day there's going to be litigation filed to start attacking this map. But those maps they're going to last in some, maybe they'll last for a whole decade until 2030, or maybe not. But demographics in North Carolina are changing radically, and that's going to affect how people vote, regardless of what those maps look like. So it would seem that the districts that might be safe seats might not be safe seats by 2026, something like that, or 2028. But that could change something. So that's a question I'd like you to speak about just a little bit, or just something to speak about. But the second thing is, you mentioned the courts, and you showed us a diagram of how the whole court system works. And one of the questions that somebody asked me to ask you before we started tonight was, do you have confidence? And I'm probably not going to answer this question myself, but do you have confidence the courts will continue to play this backstopping role effectively? Are they going to do a good job, or are they going to do a bad job? Now we have a Republican Supreme Court justice in North Carolina, and that the Supreme Court justice is the one that assigns the judges for the 3-judge panels, and that previously was a Democrat, and so that could affect things. And we know that the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, continues to do things that are really conservative. They've come up with very conservative decisions. So, if all this starts to change, are the courts going to play fair, and what are demographics going to do to the districts as the decade goes on?
Yeah, both are critical questions, and so let me start with the second one about the courts. I think we will definitely see, and I'm loath to be too predictive. My crystal ball cracked several election cycles ago, and I haven't gotten it fixed. So all of this could be, wildly off base. So I will go ahead and preface everything that I'm saying that way. But I think we will see both levels, the state courts and the federal courts, involved in redistricting yet again. This has been going on for 40 years. Excuse me. And I think it will continue into a 5th decade. The question becomes, which level of court will deal with which aspect? And here I'm primarily focused on the notion of race and its role in redistricting, and then partisanship and politics and its role in redistricting. And if I had to guess, I think the dynamic of race in redistricting will likely be dealt with in the federal courts, particularly through the 1965 and Voting Rights Act and Section 2. That is an opportunity for the Biden administration to weigh in and challenge issues that they may see problematic with redistricting using race. And the question I have is, will there be a focus on something called racial polarized voting, where typically communities of color tend to vote for one candidate and white voters tend to vote for another candidate? And part of the 1980s Thornburg case out of this state had to deal with that question: can individuals of a community of color elect one of their own, or do white voters voting for one candidate have the power to defeat that candidate and black voters' preference for that particular candidate? I think that question is going to be at the heart of what we will see in federal courts over race. The partisan dynamic, I think, will be dealt with at the state level, because the federal courts have basically closed off questions about partisan gerrymandering. And we have seen in the 2019 case, a state trial court say, yeah, you went too far with partisanship. And I think we will see that play out again. How that eventually plays and works its way up to the state Supreme Court, which is currently controlled by Democrats, but only by one justice. And again, that Article 1, Section 10 principle of free elections, what does that mean? And how does that play out in redistricting? Those are all going to be the legal questions. I think that's critical. To answer your first question about demographics, and I know that we have a question in the comments about population shifts since 2010 and the effect on redistricting this year, we have seen through the census the tremendous shifts going on the ground to urban and suburban counties in North Carolina, and the flight out of rural counties. And I think when the maps get released, particularly at the congressional level, you could potentially see a congressional district wholly housed in Mecklenburg, as the 12th is right now. You could see one wholly housed in Wake County because of population. But when you get into the eastern part of the state and the western part of the state with the mountains, those districts are going to be several counties long and wide. And that has to do with the principle of equal population. You've got to add in enough people that they are all kind of equal in the districts. So the benefit will be likely to, again, urban interest. But one of the dynamics that I'm closely watching in North Carolina, particularly among registered voters, is the propensity of registered Democrats to be in central cities like Charlotte, like Raleigh, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Asheville. And registered Republicans tend to be more fairly distributed across central cities, urban suburbs, surrounding suburban counties, and into rural counties. And so that dynamic, based on the voters having sorted themselves into various areas and precincts, may have a huge impact, even though the lines may accentuate and, for some people, aggravate that kind of dynamic.
I'm going to shift something here for just a second, and then I'm going to come back to a couple other things. I was in Raleigh on the 10th of August, and I testified before the Joint Redistricting Committee. And Warren Daniel, Senator Warren Daniel, who's on the Senate Redistricting Committee and on the Joint Committee, stood up before we started the testimony, and he said, North Carolina has been the epicenter of redistricting lawsuits for decades. It's time to put the last 30 years of litigation behind us and begin a new era of nonpartisan map drawing. Warren Daniel is in the Republican majority in Raleigh, and he's telling us that this is what they're going to do. And my sense is that's not what they're going to do. So we're going to find out here what they come up with in a couple of weeks.
I think what historically we have seen is that particularly the minority party wants redistricting reform and wants independent redistricting. The problem is when they become the majority, what did we say about redistricting? Oh, no. We want to keep power.
Yeah.
And that is a dynamic of pure self-political interest in that regard. I would be surprised if redistricting reform would come about. I know that there are prominent Republicans that have been advocating for it, and potentially for a situation where I hate to disagree with the senator, but I doubt that we will get through this next 10 years without a lawsuit being filed. My prediction is a lawsuit will be filed within 24 to 48 hours after the final maps are adopted. So we will face another decade. The question is, do we face another decade where we have multiple maps in that 10 years? I mean, generally the principle of redistricting is it's one and done. You do it and it lasts for 10 years. North Carolina hasn't had a complete set of congressional or state legislative districts hold for 10 years since 1990. So, I think that we will potentially, if history is any indicator, have another round of redistricting. The question is, will a reform effort be in the works for that eventual redistricting 2025, whenever it occurs? I just don't know. And that's a dynamic that has to be done by the majority party.
One of the things that I get asked by people is, what can we do as individuals that want to see don't want politicians to be picking their voters anymore? How can we force them to create a system where citizens or some other fashion of people would actually draw the maps, be going through this process instead of these guys in Raleigh doing it however they're doing it? In your book, this is a quote out of your book. It says, noting that North Carolina, I'm not sure who was speaking in this, North Carolina had no initiative or referendum process, and that the governor lacked veto power over legislation, including redistricting bills. The court held that the people of the state have no practical mean by which to rectify an imbalance of representation in one of the most powerful legislative bodies in America. Boy, that's a mouthful of stuff.
I believe that was Elena Kagan's dissent in the Rucho case.
Okay.
And what she was acknowledging. So Chief Justice Roberts, in his majority opinion, had indicated the states are the best able to deal with this issue of partisan gerrymandering. There are things like voter initiatives, referendums. The citizens of states can change their laws, their constitutions. They can go after the process. The problem in North Carolina is that at this type of policy level, what we are probably talking about is a constitutional amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And for any constitutional amendment to make it to the voters, it has to go through the General Assembly first. And generally, the majority party controls what constitutional amendments will come before the voters, who then get the chance to have the say on it. You talk about you mentioned the issue of the governor not having the veto power. That is very much evident. Governors in North Carolina do not have the power of the veto over redistricting legislation. And we were one of the last states to give our governor a veto power.
Right.
And in fact, the individual who wrote the legislation that eventually became the gubernatorial veto power made the decision not to include redistricting legislation as part of that veto power. That gentleman by the name of Roy Cooper.
There you go. A question just came in, and fellow asked, how do other countries like Canada, England, and Germany deal with this? And before you take that question, I will tell you that I spoke before a group of young international um, people about 3 or 4 years ago, I guess, at International House here in Charlotte, and they were traveling all around the country, and they stayed in Charlotte overnight, and they wanted to hear about gerrymandering, and most of those countries didn't have it, or they'd gotten rid of it. But in other countries, Michael, how do countries deal with this sort of issue and problem that we the voters don't have? We can't force the legislature to do what we think is right, and they're going to keep themselves in power by whatever means, and we're reliant on demographic changes in the courts to make our democracy work. So,
yeah, that is a fascinating question, and I will be the first to acknowledge that in the discipline of political science, there's generally those folks that study the United States, and there are those folks that study everybody else. I'm an Americanist. I study the United States. I've got my hands full just trying to understand North Carolina politics, let alone the country at large. I am not an expert on how other countries, other countries do utilize legislative districts. The British House of Commons is based on constituencies, geographic regions. So too is Canada. I'm just not an expert in those areas to know the full dynamics of how they go about dealing with. They may not have. I think one of the key issues that really sets the United States apart on this is the notion of equal population. That, one person, one vote matters across legislative districts. And I think at times, while that is an important fundamental point, that oftentimes constrains ways of trying to draw these districts that inherently exacerbate other issues that are obvious to us as well. I hate to dodge the question on what other countries do, but I'm not that expert on that. I know that we have a question about Section 2 of the 1965 and whether we have a first draft of the 14 congressional districts. To talk a little bit about the 1965 Voting Rights Act, Section 2 is a provision that covers the entire country. And what Section 2 allows is for the Department of Justice to intervene and to challenge election laws, some of them based on redistricting, to question the role of race and whether voters of color in particularly are being disproportionately impacted. I think the key question in my mind is that Section 2 requires that the burden of proof be on the federal government, whereas Section 5, the states had to prove that they weren't discriminating. Section 2 requires that the Department of Justice go after and prove racial discrimination in election laws. It's a different burden test, and that's going to be something that the courts, I think, are going to have questions about to see how that plays out. In terms of the 14 new congressional districts, we don't have a map. I would say stay tuned. Maybe by Friday, we potentially could see a first version of a final draft of a congressional district map. There's been a lot of questions about where that 14th congressional district would go. There's some discussion about in the southeastern part of the state, particularly around Wilmington. That area has seen tremendous population gains. There's also been discussion about putting the district west of Charlotte going into the mountains. It's really probably already drawn. We're just waiting for somebody to go to a computer terminal in Raleigh and start drawing out the map. We'll just have to wait and see.
Was there any other questions, Alex, that came in? I'm not seeing them on my screen. Okay, here's one.
I think there's one about the use of racial data. Would this hinder or aid our attempt in preventing gerrymandering during the redistricting process? I think that that's going to be a great question for the courts to have to wrestle with. I think what you are hearing out of the legislators is that race will not be utilized in their redistricting process. But that what we have seen in previous court cases does seem to indicate, and this is a principle of particularly racially polarized voting, that that may be a trigger by which the courts intervene and review the maps and the constitutionality of it. Until we have the maps drawn and released, I'm not real sure with any certainty any of us could really say, how is race going to play a factor in all of this? We know that it will. And again, the likelihood is that's going to be the major impetus for the federal courts to do their review of these maps.
One of the things that was interesting to me about the process that the Joint Redistricting Committee set up is they said they were going to have but one hearing or presentation after the maps were done. I was at Charlotte City Council, had a hearing last night on the 3 maps from which they're going to select the map. County Commission in Mecklenburg County is doing that tonight, and the school board is almost ready to do that as well. Yeah. But here we've got the state legislature, the House and Senate, and the U.S. House of Representatives, and they have decided that they're maybe have one hearing, if they're going to have any hearing at all. It doesn't give you a lot of faith in democracy when people play the game that way, and it's hard to swallow that. I don't know. Go ahead, Michael. Excuse me.
No, it's just I think the issue of transparency, particularly when it comes to issues of legislating and redistricting, has such a huge impact and is so important that, you know, having the opportunity for the public to weigh in on political decisions and policy decisions of this magnitude is an important thing. The question ultimately becomes, are legislators willing to listen, or do they have their minds made up and the map's already drawn and this is all for show? I think that will come out in what we have seen in the past in court hearings and witness testimony as to how the process played out. I think that will probably get some prime attention by judges of either stripe.
I know we're over a little bit here, so I guess we're supposed to sign off and say goodnight. But I was in your book, you say, and you said it earlier, that these maps in 1990, yeah, the 1980, you said these would be the last unchallenged set of maps that the General Assembly would draw for the next 40 years. And you may be amending your book in 7 or 8 years. It's going to say it's going to change to 50 years instead of 40 years. I suspect that 40-year record is not going to hold up very long. But Michael, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thanks to Levine Museum from me. I appreciate being asked to have this conversation with you. It's really fun and really interesting. And the book is not easy to read, and it's not a book that you're going to read on the beach in the summer. But boy, if you care, if you care about democracy and the thorns in its side, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there to understand. So
Well, thank you so much, Harry. I greatly appreciate your time as well for this event. And thanks also to the Levine Museum and the staff for putting this together. It was really appreciated. So,
okay. Thank you.
Hope everybody has a good night.
Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. I enjoyed it, and maybe we'll see you out on the street someplace or at a protest march against the new maps.
Thanks, everybody.